some of the Chick-fil-A. It's certainly be thankful for all of you. I just want to take a few minutes before our director comes to introduce our speaker for a time of prayer or any particular prayer request or concerns that you'd like to share at this particular time. Yes, ma'am.
Prayer for the violence in the city.
Prayer for whom?
Violence.
Yes, yes, you did. Yes, you did. Anyone else? Anything?
Hey John, my wife, so she was behind a teenager a couple days ago who kind of freaked out trying to merge, and she stopped quick and she's cracked her bone right there. So she's just in a lot of pain today, so I appreciate any prayers for her.
Yes,
because happy wife, happy life.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, yeah. Papa needs to be happy too. And the spouse happy. Say amen. Amen. Thank God for all of you. Come on, let's pray together. We tell God our Father, thank you for the beauty of the day, the blessings of life, the joy and the privilege that is ours to be in your presence. And Lord, we just thank you for each and every person that is here. We pray now your blessings be upon them, and prosper, and we have good success. And we say your presence, your power, and your peace. Lord, give them assurances in whatever they're dealing with, challenged by opportunities that they have. But even now, you're right there with them. Lift up to you our director's wife, and pray for him, pray for his home, pray for his wife, pray for her comfort, her peace, her strength, pray for healing. Lord, we pray about all of the senseless violence that's taking place in our community. Lord, we're praying now that you do what only you can do, because you're able to do exceedingly abundantly beyond anything we can even imagine, think or ask for, according to your Holy Spirit, what in you. Lord, bless now each and every person. Meet them at the point of their own particular needs. Remove any fears, any doubts, any anxiety. Make today and the days ahead be the best days of our life. Bless our director as he comes and share with us our speaker, presenter. Lord, give us a heart of wisdom so we can be more and more like him. Bless us now. In Christ Jesus' name I pray. Let us all say amen. Amen.
It's such an honor to have you here today. I hope you did make it yourself at home and get some Chick-fil-A. But I want to introduce a friend of mine. This is Don Setzer and he and his wife Kim, their son Corey. They're an amazing family and make a big difference. He has served as a trustee with the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary and helps a lot of churches, a lot of pastors. And I'll be frank with you, there are a lot of ways that we could get this kind of information to you, but Don actually has a caseload of ministers, pastors. He does this. And so sometimes people will come and say, I get the framework of that, I understand that, but can you help me? And he will say, yes, I will help you. And so that's the kind of person I wanted to come and speak with you today and give you this very crucial information. So Don, thank you for driving up from Saraland, Alabama to share with us today. And we will have this recorded, so if you miss something and you want to get that recorded, you can do that. So Don, you just take it away, and we appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. Appreciate it very much. Am I on there, brother? Yes, sir. Okay. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you this morning, and we look forward to hopefully sharing some good information for all of you ministers and staffers and administrative people for the various churches in the Birmingham Metro Association. I prepare these like I prepare to teach Sunday school. I have a 30-minute Sunday school time, and I've got 3 hours worth of notes. Well, I think we've got 90 minutes today, and this leadership training seminar is normally a 4-hour seminar. So we're going to crush 4 hours into 90 minutes. So I may go a little fast from time to time, but just wave or do the little Carol Burnett ear pull like she used to do, saying hello to her parents, I think, on television show each week. If you have questions, please feel free to, don't be bashful, just toss them out. If it's something of a more personal nature, your specific tax question that you may have, feel free to talk with me afterwards. And but I have never finished a Sunday school lesson in all the years of teaching and speaking at churches. I have never finished a seminar, so I do not expect to finish today all of this information. There's a lot of handouts. Hopefully will be beneficial to you. Just to look at your pamphlet just for a minute. The left side is what I call the personal side. It just has a little bit of information about myself, my experience. I graduated in '79 from the University of South Alabama with a business degree and a concentration in accounting, and I've worked for several firms along the way. Out of college, my first firm was what's now called Ernst & Young. It was Ernst & Winnie back in the day. They were one of the top big four firms in the world. They had an office in Mobile, and I was honored to work with them for several years, and then I've worked for other CPA firms along the way. I've had my own firm since '92. There's a bio in there that tells a little bit about our experience and some of the, on the local, state, and national level. As Dr. Crane mentioned, served as a trustee at New Orleans for 10 years, and really enjoyed that opportunity. And so hopefully there'll be some insight that you'll gain from the information today. There's a list of some of the other presentations that we have, should you be interested in inviting us to come to your church or your associational group beyond the association here. Here are some of the other PowerPoints that we do have. We put together over the years, and if you just want me to email you one of them, you say, hey, that electronic giving looks good, why don't you email it to me? I'll be glad to. My card is in there, and I think there's also a little sheet requesting information, so anything that you would like that we don't touch upon in enough detail for you, feel free to let me know. There's a group of agreed upon procedures. My firm, I'm a solo practitioner. I used to do audits. I've done church audits before, but because of peer review requirements, which means even if I do one audit a year, I have about a $5,000 or $6,000 peer review requirement. They have to come in and look at the audit papers after I've done an audit. That's every 3 years, and it's just cost prohibitive for me to do an audit and then have to pay $5,000 or $6,000 for somebody to come in. And so we're not doing audits right now, but we do the procedures projects. We'll talk about that in some of the slides in just a little bit. But there's a list of those if your church might be interested in talking to me or having some more information about that. The list of our references. If you're interested, Dr. Mike Shaw, we had dinner with him last night. He's, as most of you know, Pastor Emeritus at First Baptist Pelham, and we enjoyed, he and I served at New Orleans together for several years as trustees. And Lee Wright, I've worked with for the state board several conferences along the way, and and also the DOM, the Mobile Association, Dr. Thomas Wright. And so if you're interested in contacting any of them, feel free to do so. A bio, and then 2 or 3 reference letters, including one that Dr. Crane graciously provided last year after our talk up here, and also being a visitor on his podcast. And then the last, on the left page, this is the slides. And so we're going to go through them as quickly as we can. But again, if you have a question, somebody else probably is going to ask that same question and just may be afraid to. So feel free to ask any questions that you might have. On the right side is the agenda we're going to try to cover. As you see, that's a lot for 90 minutes, so we'll do our very best. Place for you to take some notes. Again, that participation request form, any of the other PowerPoints or anything else that you might have. I usually have someone ask for some supplemental information every time I do a presentation, and then some other handouts, and we'll talk about those as we get along the way, okay? And I presume I just hit the forward. There we go. I've got a couple of handouts. The first one there is called 14 Traits of Effective Church Leadership. We won't go through all of those in detail, of course, but I just saw that in an article not too long ago, and I thought they were very beneficial. Whether you're a senior pastor, whether you're administrative executive pastor of the church, whether you're a student minister, or worship, children's minister, whatever, you're in a leadership position. And so I thought those were very good to just jot down and put in the packet. As a church leader, those are some of the things to take a look at and be aware of as you're involved with your ministry. I've been doing returns since 1992. I've done IMB missionary returns since, I think we started those in 94. A friend of ours was on, graduated from what's now the University of Mobile College at the time. Was a classmate of my wife's, and he was home on furlough from Lesotho in the southern part of Africa, and they had a missions conference at the university, and I met him. My wife introduced me to him, and during tax season, he called and said, would you be interested in doing my income tax return? I said, well, I'd be honored. And so we got together, and I got his information, and they use something called a country of earnings statement that supplements their W-2. So just to make sure I was understanding it, you know, some bureaucrats there in the IMB offices developed that form. So if you've ever dealt with the IMB, they're great folks. But I just wanted to make sure I was following the numbers there. So I called up there one day, and I was correct. I was reading the information correctly on their housing allowance situation and so forth. And I thanked her for her time. And during June or July that summer, she called and said, would you be interested in being a referral for the International Mission Board? And, you know, when I picked myself off the floor, I said, well, certainly, it would be an honor. So ever since then, for several years, I was in their referral list when they actually sent W-2s out to all the missionaries all over the world. And I'm no longer on that list, but I still do quite a few missionary returns. And so have some wonderful stories I'll share another time with you. But the contacts with missionaries, I'm not called to the mission field, but I do feel like the Lord's called me to have some of this information available to share with groups like yours, and some wonderful opportunities there along the way, and working with missionaries. And again, there's some church treasure tips. Some of these we will talk about in the slides, but again, information for you as passing along to your church treasurer finance committee team. I was 22 years old and went to a Wednesday night business meeting, which is a little bit unusual for a 22-year-old to be interested in going to a business meeting with a 3,500 member church, but I did. And the pastor was at the state convention, so he wasn't there, and the moderator was conducting the meeting. And when I had new business, one of my mentors, I think 4th grade Sunday school teacher, stood up and said, I'd like to nominate Donnie Setzer to be the treasurer of the church. And I said, wow. No discussion beforehand, no time to pray about it, just, hey, here we go. I want you to be the church treasurer. And so I reluctantly agreed. I didn't know, and assumed I wasn't qualified for that role at such a young age, and not having been on any committees and so forth. That's how I got my start in church leadership, is from the floor of a business meeting one Wednesday night. So it's been an interesting process along the way, and I've enjoyed every bit of it. And again, hopefully you'll get some information from what we're talking about today. Okay? Those are reading glasses, so I can't see with them on for the slides. So dual status is the first thing we're going to talk about real quickly. Okay? As an ordained, how many are ordained ministers? Can I assume all of you are, or most all of you? As an ordained minister, you have a dual status. You have a multiple status as an ordained minister, but for tax purposes, as far as the IRS is concerned, you have a dual status. You're an employee of the church for federal and state income tax purposes. We're in Alabama, so of course we have Alabama state income taxes. I gave a presentation in Milton, Florida a couple of weeks ago, and had to change a couple of slides because Florida doesn't have state income tax. So I had to take a couple of references to state income tax out of there. But of course, as Alabamians, we have a state income tax along with, of course, our federal tax responsibility. So for federal and state income tax purposes, you are an employee of the church. That means, among other things, you get a W-2. One of my good friends called me last week. He's been an intentional interim, and this was his second tax season. He's just finished that opportunity. He's now working with another church in the same community as an intentional interim. He said, guess what? For the second year in a row, they gave me a 1099. and no reference to what my housing allowance was. What do you think I should do? And I said, well, you probably ought to contact the treasurer. This church has been in existence about 25 years, and one gentleman's been doing everything for 25 years. He's been the church treasurer. He writes the checks. He makes the deposits. He goes to the bank. He does everything. And of course, internal controls for a situation like that are so scary to even consider. Whether he's doing something wrong or not, there's no evidence of it. But that's just too much responsibility for one person in a church and not having segregation of duties. But anyway, that's their situation. And so he's got to call him back and say, at the very least, you need to give me something on a church letterhead that shows what my housing allowance is for the year. Because otherwise, my CPA can't do my tax return. We're going to talk about that in just a minute, how that process works with the housing allowance. And I'm continue to be surprised and amazed at how many people, ordained ministers, do not understand that concept of a housing allowance, whether it's available to you or not, and then if if you are eligible for it, how to go about taking care of it and doing it the right way. And I've got an example of how I ask my clients to provide the information for a housing allowance. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But meanwhile, the dual status means that for federal and state income taxes, you're an employee, but you're self-employed for self-employment tax purposes. And so what that means, if you worked at Walmart, they would take out 6.2% of your gross wages for Social Security tax and 1.45% for Medicare tax. That's a total of 7.65%. They withhold that from your check as a Walmart employee. And then Walmart matches that, and they send in an equal amount. So that's a total of 15.3% that goes in on your behalf. You're responsible for half of it. Walmart would be responsible for half of it. Well, as an ordained minister, again, you're self-employed, and you pay self-employment tax. You do not pay Social Security and Medicare tax. It's essentially the same thing, but the difference is you pay both halves of it. You pay the 15.3% self-employment tax on your wages, so they are not allowed to take anything out for Social Security tax from your check or Medicare tax, because you're an ordained minister and technically you're not responsible for that tax. You're responsible for self-employment tax. They can do that voluntarily. If you and the church agrees, they can set aside withholdings for federal income tax and or self-employment tax and then state income tax on a voluntary basis. But otherwise, you would be responsible for making quarterly estimates for that. But again, that's a distinction between that an ordained minister has as far as the self-employment tax responsibilities. Okay? Any questions? Just stop me if I start seeing some people nodding and their heads hitting the table in front of them. I know it's gotten a little too boring, but anyway, that's where we're at. Okay? And again, the degree of control that the church has makes a determination. Again, even though my example, the gentleman has been an intentional interim there for about a year and a half, the IRS would classify him as an employee, even though he's not the permanent senior pastor. And he should have gotten a W-2 the other day, but he didn't, again, for the second year in a row. We talked to him last year about it, and they just chose not to change their policy, and so he got another 1099. I still know how to do his tax return as a result of that, but I do not know what his housing allowance was, and need to have something in writing for that purpose to calculate the housing allowance designation. Okay? All right, here we are about the housing allowance. As an ordained minister, that's one of the significant advantages that you are able to take advantage of. And what that means is an amount of money can be designated by the church and given to you, set aside for the purposes of the eligible expenses. And there's a list there, if I'm on the right slide. Emma? Well, let's see, the eligible expenses mortgage payments, both principal and interest, all of your utilities, any repairs, your property taxes, your pool. I had a gentleman that I did his return while he was overseas as a pastor of a church in Tokyo, Japan, after having retired from the International Mission Board after 20 plus years of service. He moved back to the States 3 or 4 years ago and called me up and said, hey, my wife and I, and he's now like 83 years old, so he was late 70s, my wife and I are going to build a pool in our backyard where we can go and exercise, not have to go to the Y or whatever. And I want to make sure that that pool and those expenses related to that would be an eligible housing expense. Yes, it is. And he's no longer on the staff, but he gets Guidestone retirement. And for those of you maybe getting close to that age, I don't see anybody in here that probably would be, but at some point, if you have Guidestone as your retirement vehicle, you can designate some or up to 100% of your retirement funds as a housing allowance. So you continue to take advantage of this housing allowance opportunity even after you have retired from the ministry. And that's basically what he was going to do. And his pool's going to cost like $20,000 or $30,000. And so that was eligible, and they designated 100% of both his and his wife's retirement as part of his housing allowance that year because he was building a pool. I think I skipped one of the slides there that I think would be good information. As I said, the most advantageous tax benefit to ministers is the housing allowance. It must be designated in writing, and it is not retroactive. So today is February the 8th, I believe, right? So if you had a church business meeting last night, for example, February the 7th, and the church voted for your housing allowance, that vote would be beginning February 7th, moving forward. You say, well, I forgot to do anything about it last December. Well, it's too late. You have to vote, have it in writing, and have it voted on in a church business meeting, but it's moving forward. So as of last night, and then you can have the same figure for the next 5 years, or you can change it once a month. The pool situation, an example, I had someone in that same Florida session we talked about last week, and we were talking about some of the eligible housing expenses, and he said, well, something, he was talking to one of the other pastors about, looking at houses and probably will have a down payment. And we had not talked about that before. I said, oh, are you not aware that your down payment would be an eligible housing expense? And he said, oh, really? So he looked at the executive pastor that he was chatting with earlier and said, so can I change my housing allowance to reflect the fact that I'm probably going to have a $10,000 or $15,000 down payment? And he said, yes, you can. And he looked at me and he said, yes, that is correct. So again, if you're looking to build a home or buy a home, have a down payment, what you can do is, with the church's permission, you can go to them and say, hey, I want to update my housing allowance. It's been $15,000 and you want it to be $30,000 if you're going to make a $15,000 down payment coming up on the purchase of a new home. And then you're in a situation where you can take advantage of that. And the key point there, I guess, does this one have a laser? I guess not. But the key point is the third little bullet on that housing allowance. And this is very, very important. So make sure that you understand this. And this is something that you have to do every year. This is not a once in a ministry type situation. You have to go through this process each and every year. And those of you that don't like this process, you can thank Rick Warren, retired pastor from out in California that wrote The Purpose-Driven Life. He's the one that indirectly caused this because he had a $76,000 housing allowance. Of course, California, the expenses, anybody live in California here? I haven't, but I hear it's sort of expensive to live out there. He had a $76,000 housing allowance. The IRS declined that because they thought it was excessive. He had all the proof, according to the laws at that time. He took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and Rick Warren won the Supreme Court case. They voted in his favor. So he was able to take that $76,000 housing allowance. That was in 2002. And within 6 months or so, the Congress changed the law, and we now utilize this for the last 20, 22 years. And it's the lesser of your actual expenses. Your designated housing allowance is paid to you by the church, or the fair rental value of either your residence, or if you're renting a rental property. I'm working on a brand new return for a gentleman up in Tennessee. He moved from Illinois. He's a student minister. He now lives in Tennessee. And I looked at his return for the prior year, which I always like to do when I'm taking over a client. And they did not go through this process on his housing allowance last year. So he may have an amended return that might be due as a result of that. And I found that quite a bit along the way. But the lesser of those three figures is the maximum amount of housing allowance that you can take in a year. Yes, sir.
So that fair rental value of the residence, does that include a furnished home? Would that be the fair rental value of a furnished home in that neighborhood?
Yes, it includes, it's a furnished, and then for this calculation, you also can add your actual utilities to that figure. But it is furnished. And again, well, how do you come up with that figure? This Tennessee pastor, I was talking with him a couple of days ago, and I told him what needs to be done. This is not required by the IRS, but it's strongly suggested. And that is to get a realtor letter, get a letter from a realtor in that area where you're at that says the residence at 406 Pine Street in Vestavia Hills, the fair rental value furnished of that place is whatever, $4,000 a month, and then that would be $48,000, and then whatever your actual utilities are for that year, you can add to that, and that's your fair rental value calculation. So it's A, B, or C. Actual, which includes all the items that we just talked about, the property taxes, your principal and interest, your repairs, the pool, the lawn maintenance, all those things. So actual, designated, which is what the church pays you, or the fair rental value. So yes, sir, that is correct. Okay, that clear that up? Okay, all right. Any other questions? If you have what's called an excess housing allowance, which means if you, let's say you spent $20,000 for the year, and your designated housing paid to you by the church was $24,000, and your fair rental value was, say, $36,000. So you spent $20,000, but you were paid $24,000. That would be an excess housing allowance scenario, because you had $4,000 that was paid to you that technically you didn't spend for the eligible expenses. So that $4,000 has to be brought back into income. Again, that's the purpose of this, is to determine how much of this housing can be excluded from your income. So that's a tax tool, a tax resource for you as an ordained minister. But if you go throughout the year and you're not properly monitoring it, or if you didn't spend as much as you thought, that's why you need to look at it. And there's some forms in here for ministers, and we'll look at them in a minute in the handouts, for you to go through each year where you can try to be on target to have your actual and what's being designated. You don't want to spend 20 a year and get 24 or 30 or 35, because you're going to have an excess housing allowance. That $4,000 in that example has to be brought back into income on line 1 of your 1040 and the applicable line of your Form 40 for Alabama. And the bad news is, that's part of the bad news, is you're having income that you weren't really planning on. And the other perspective, you probably didn't make any tax provisions for that. If you were assuming plugging along throughout the year, and you said, well, I'm going to be okay and not have to worry about any excess, but if you spent 20, but you were paid 24 by the church, that's $4,000 extra income. It's just like a bonus on December 31st, if you will. It's have to be added to your tax return, and if you haven't made any tax provision for it, then guess what? You'll be writing them a check, you know, on or before April 15th. Do you have a question, sir?
Two questions.
Yes, sir.
So, I saw that it said it's preferable that it's in a separate check.
Yes, sir. It's preferable, but it's not required by the IRS. If you're getting it all in one check, that's fine. You just have to make sure that at tax time, when the church financial secretary is reporting that information to you, and then when you're passing that along to your accountant, CPA, or if you're doing it yourself, that you know you are aware of what was compensation and what was housing allowance out of those single checks, if you will, throughout the year. So I prefer, when I'm talking to a minister or a pastor going to a new church, or I'm talking to a church and giving this kind of training to church treasurers or administrators, I recommend to them that it's in a separate check. That way you've got a better trail, if you will, what that figure is. If it's $2,000 a month, just write a second check for $2,000, and most payroll softwares will track that, such that for a minister it's housing, and it'll pop on line 14, which is an optional block in the W-2. This is housing allowance, $24,000, and then you give your W-2 to your tax preparer, or if you're doing it yourself, then you can go through that lesser of calculation and have both, instead of trying to look on a pay stub and, well, it's all one check, and for whatever reasons you didn't break it out, and how much was, because you don't want to pay federal and state income tax on that, on both of those figures if you don't have to. Another question?
Okay, question.
Yes, sir.
So this is allowable for who? Let's say you're maybe ordained minister, but you're working for a nonprofit,
Okay,
or you're a missionary.
okay.
Who is this allowed for? Is it just pastors, or?
No, if you're an ordained minister and the organization that you are working for is recognizing you as an ordained minister, and you are performing services in relationship to your ministry as an ordained minister, under normal circumstances, you would be eligible for a housing allowance as well. There are some institutions, nonprofits, colleges, and so forth that may not, as a policy of their institution, their organization, allow you that privilege, if you will, but it is a possibility for you. Okay? Other questions? Are we having fun here? Okay. Again, I said the eligible expenses. Marissa didn't know I was blind. Being this far, with some binoculars there. You must pay self-employment tax on both your compensation and your housing allowance, which is 15.3%. Or guess what? Let's say you're in a parsonage. I don't want to embarrass anybody, but ask that kind of, but there are still a few churches that have parsonages that allow their senior ministers, or even some of their other staff ministers, to live in parsonages. Guess what? You have to pay self-employment tax on the fair rental value of that parsonage. You're not just living there rent-free. You may think you are, but the IRS says, no, we want to get some more of your money. And so I more than once have taken over a new client. I know one in particular I can remember. He literally almost started crying when I met with him and saw his prior year return. And he was using a CPA firm in the southeast part of Alabama. And so you would think they would know how to do a minister's tax return, but he'd been living in a parsonage for about 9 or 10 years. And they weren't doing anything about taking that into consideration. He was just living there rent-free. Church was paying the utilities. He didn't know, or he assumed he didn't know. I don't think he knew when I started meeting with him and talking with him. I think he genuinely did not know that was part of the law. And so we talked about, and we fixed 3 years, because he said, I want to go back at least 3 years because they can audit me for those 3 years. So we amended his returns for 3 years, and he added the fair rental value of that parsonage. I was surprised that he wanted to do that, and again, in this situation, I was certainly willing to do it, but well, he's just being honest. I'm just being honest, brother. We're all here with pulling the onion back, right? When I told him I could could get a finder's fee if I turned him in. That's what changed his mind. I'm like, no, I'm just. Okay, the next slide is a sample allowance designation, and then there's also, over on the right side, there's a couple of sheets from the IRS, just some Q&As on ministers and housing allowance. Again, it's the same thing we talked about. If you have questions on that, publication 517 with the IRS, just go to irs.gov and request publication 517. It's called Social Security and Other Information for Members of the Clergy and Religious Workers. And that is a very good resource. So if you haven't read that along with your quiet time and your sermon preparation, that may be one that you may want to pull together. But anyway, then I have 2 or 3 examples here from 2 or 3 sources of sample resolutions where you get the church to approve it in a business meeting what your allowance is. And again, as I said, you can change it every 6 months. There's language in there that says until and unless it is changed, it is continuing, if you will. In other words, you don't have to do it every December. You can have it in effect for 10 years. Of course, with inflation and all the things, utility costs going up and so forth, you certainly want to look at it from a tax standpoint. Each year, you probably would end up being able to needing to change it, but anyway. But again, as I said, it's also, you can't go back from a year or 2 ago. I met with a couple who he was bivocational, worked for a paper mill north of Mobile, and was also a Church of Christ minister. And literally, she did start crying when we talked about, because he was retiring from that church and coming on staff at another church, and I was doing their payroll. So I was meeting with him to set his payroll up, and she literally started crying when I talked. Well, I had looking at your prior year return, and I don't see anything about a housing allowance. She said, "What's a housing allowance? What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, okay, blah blah blah." She started crying. I had to go get the Kleenex box. I didn't mean to upset her, because I had done a little quick calculation, and he'd been in the ministry for 20 or 25 years. And I said, well, here's approximate annual additional taxes you have paid because you didn't take advantage of housing. And she started crying. And she said, do you still take new clients for tax returns? I said, yes, ma'am. So you've got a client for life. And they both have passed away and gone on to be with the Lord. But I did their return from that day forward because as bad as that information was to hear, you know, they were leaving a lot of tax dollars on the table by not taking advantage of that. Questions? So there, the slide, and then as I said, I think I've got 3. One of them is from Guidestone. The last one, I believe, it says sample forms and expenses. Guidestone has a wonderful minister's clergy tax guide. They just issued it within the last week. So go to their guidestone.org, I believe is their website. I get an email each year, here it is, and I download it. I've got it on my desktop, on my computer, plus I buy another clergy tax book by a guy named Dan Busby, who's a national expert with clergy taxes. And so I do plenty of ministerial returns, so I want to have as much information as I can. But that's the resolution, and also a list there that you can see of some of the expenses that are part of the eligible expense category that we talked about. Okay? And then there's another one right before that that's got a real good, it's called Clergy Housing Allowance Exclusion Items. Paper towel, dishwasher detergent, sponges, scrubbers. Oh my goodness. If you are spending something related to your home, I can not think right offhand of anything that wouldn't be part of an eligible expense. You may come up with something. Now, cell phones are, I get that question a lot. Cell phones, now if you have a landline phone, that is part of the eligible utility expense for housing purposes. But cell phones are, because they're, you know, part personal, part business, and the IRS doesn't allow that. But there's that exclusive, or that detailed list. Most everything, you know, if you put fertilizer out this spring for your grass, most anything will be part of that. Okay? And the last handout I want to point out real quick is an Excel that I use for each of my clients. I ask them to provide the information to me, and this is for one that another new client, the first year client, I've already done his return and mailed it back to him Monday for e-file authorization. He gave me an Excel for each month, but that's great, but I took those numbers and did another Excel sheet, and I am not an Excel expert. If anybody is in here, I need to talk with you because and my wife works at the University of Mobile, and she's a pretty good expert with it, and I come home with such basic questions when she comes home. I couldn't even, pivot tables, I mean, I don't even, that's sacrilegious language. I mean, I don't understand, I can do this, and I can do this. These are two that I prepared that you see in there. And shows the actual, the designated, and the fair rental value. And then, in his case, he had an excess of $2,300. And so, for federal and Alabama purposes, that $2,300 has to be added to his tax return. And then here's the calculation of what you pay the self-employment tax on. Okay?
Excuse me, are those examples in this packet?
Yes, it's on the right side.
Okay.
Yeah, these two Excel should be in there unless I couldn't figure out anything other than a manual way to collate 25. I did 25 packets and 20 or 25 sheets per packet. So if you don't have these two in there, come see me when we finish, and I'll be glad to get you email them and email them to you. But they should be in there. But if they're not, I just shuffling so many papers there, I may have missed it. Did you see them?
No, I'm not.
Well, you can have those if you like. I got a few more at home, so okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions on housing allowance? There's another sample similar to the ones that are in there. That's just so small, hardly anybody can read that on the slides. Again, you got a copy of the slides, but that shouldn't, it really can't help you too much. I tried to squeeze that on the slide, and it didn't do a whole lot to be able to help.
Is there a standard percentage or recommended percentage? I know it's going to vary with everybody, but is it 18%, 20%? Is there a kind of a parameter of what's recommended?
A percentage of what? Now, make sure
The
I'm.
housing allowance.
No, sir. My suggestion is to take, if nothing else, if you're being ordained for the first time, go back to the previous year where you had those eligible expenses. It could be, it could be 50% of your income. It just depends on what your costs are, what your mortgage. If you don't have a mortgage, your housing allowance shouldn't be obviously as much because, I don't know what the average mortgage payment is these days. Let's say it's $1,500. But $1,500, part of that is principal. The majority of it's interest, as you well know, any of you that have a mortgage. Well, that entire $1,500, both principal and interest, is an eligible expense. Plus, if you itemize on Schedule A for either federal or state purposes, you can take the interest there. You also can take the property taxes really in both places. So there's several little nuances of advantages, if you will, to an ordained minister. That's a couple of them. But to say a percentage of your income or a percentage, I don't really have a figure in mind, but it's based on what you feel like. If you go through those expenses and you say, okay, I'm going to spend an average of $2,000 a month for that, for my mortgage, for my utilities, and those other expenses, divided by 12, if you will. If this would average about $2,000 a month, then I want my housing allowance coming from the church at about $2,000 a month. You don't want it $4,000. You don't want it twice as much because you're going to have excess housing each year. Because again, you're getting 4, but you're only paying 2. I don't know if that helps to answer your question, but okay. All right, W-2 versus 1099 NEC. we talked about that to some extent. Basically, as an ordained minister, you should be getting a W-2. Shows your compensation in block 1. If you're a part of a retirement plan, a 403B plan, or some other kind of a plan with either Guidestone or some other entity, block 12, there should be an amount shown as to what your pre-tax contributions are to that plan. If your church provides you with medical insurance, DD is the code for under block 12. The church secretary should be showing the amount of insurance that you are being provided, the dollar amount that the church is paying the premium for. If you have over $50,000 in life insurance through the church, any premiums over $50,000, there's a block or a code for that in block 12. And then block 14 is optional, but I strongly recommend that the churches put the amount of the housing allowance in that block 14. If they don't put it there, you need to get a letter like I talked about with my friend that's got the 1099. Well, there's no place on the 1099 NEC for housing allowance. Why? Because that's not the right form to be used. I mean, I'm not being smarty pants, but that's the situation. So it should have been the W-2. But if it's not on W-2 or the 1099, again, we talk about providing a letter to the minister where he knows what his housing allowance is and he can pass that along for tax purposes. 1099 NEC, oh, I'm sorry.
Quick question.
Yes, sir, brother.
Block 12 retirement contributions, is that the contribution from the minister, or if there's a matching from the church, would you put both?
Normally, it's just the amount that's being withheld for the purposes of the employee, the minister.
Is that a big deal if that's not on there?
Well,
not that ours aren't on there.
Oh, I'm just, you're speaking for this brother over here, right?
Yeah, Josh said this one here.
He did leave up. I would say it's, quote, it's not a big deal. I did a return the other day that it wasn't on there. The block 1 figure, I presume, was right. It was marked retirement. There's a block down there that says retirement plan, and it was X, but there was nothing in box 12. I said, well, if you're in a retirement plan, why isn't there a figure on there? In their case, it was all church contributions. And so I had to do a little extra research to double check, and technically it says that if it's employer contribution, it doesn't have to be on the W-2 in block 12. If it's employee or ministerial contributions, it's supposed to be, because among other reasons, if you're trying to balance out what the compensation is and making sure it's correct, if you don't have that figure, it may be difficult to sort of match the numbers up. So, but if another church, not your church, of course, but if another church, for whatever reason, did not put that on the W-2, it's not earth-shattering. You wouldn't need to. I wouldn't recommend that you do an amended W-2. That gets you off of the.
Yeah, that helps. That's what I needed.
Okay. Any other questions? I'm sorry I missed you. Okay. Again, we talked about no Social Security or Medicare tax withheld for an ordained minister. You pay it yourself. You can have the voluntary withholding with the church. You tell the church, hopefully you go to your accountant, CPA, and say, okay, here's my compensation. I'm going to get this much in compensation. I'm going to get this much in housing allowance. What is my estimated federal income tax requirement, my self-employment tax requirement, which also goes on the federal return, and your Alabama component. And so I do that, I calculate it, and I say, here it is. If you're paid once a month, tell them to take 1/12 of this out if it's a voluntary withholding. If you're making quarterly estimates, we divide it by 4, and I print vouchers, and I say, okay, this is what you pay April 15th, June 15th, September 15th, and January 15th for the previous year, but the final installments due January 15th. And a couple of days this year fall on Sunday, so it's like the 16th, I think, of September, but those time frames. Okay? quick question on the, or quick story on the 1099 to the W-9. Everybody knows what a W-9 is. If you have a speaker that comes in for a revival, still have revivals in South Alabama, not about Birmingham, but we still have them once in a while. Or someone that's an independent contractor, may a lawn care service, or something of that nature where they're not your employee, but you pay them over $600 in a calendar year, you're required to give them a 1099 NEC, non-employee compensation. And so you're supposed to give a W-9, which is an IRS form that says the name of their business, their address, their city and state, whether they're a corporation, an LLC, a partnership, an S Corp, a C Corp, or sole proprietor, and either their federal ID number or their social security number. If they're a corporation, if it was Birmingham Lawn Care Incorporated, they're a corporation and you don't have to give them a 1099 NEC. If they're Don Setzer Landscaping, and I'm a sole proprietor and I'm just out trying to make a living, and I'm paid over $600, I'm supposed to get a 1099 NEC from that church. Even if I don't get it, guess what I'm supposed to do with that income? You're supposed to report it. I'm really surprised, and again, I'm not banging you guys and ladies because I know you wouldn't do that, but I'm surprised at the number of ministers that look at me cross-eyed when we talk about this and say, I mean, the one in Florida the other day, we're talking about love offerings. If we get to it, it slides a little bit. So I told him, you know, here's the rules. So I just need to ask for cash, and there won't be a trail. I mean, he was sitting like where this brother was, and I was close to the conference table. So well, I mean, I looked at him. Executive pastor was over here, and the senior pastor, who I've been doing his return for years, was over on the table. And I thought he was joking, just trying to be funny. He wasn't. He wasn't there. He's the only one I hadn't heard from. I sent a thank you email to everybody for inviting me to attend. Just, that's what I do. And he's the only one I hadn't heard from. I wonder why. And I wasn't soliciting to do his work or anything. I just thank you for the opportunity. And he did have some pretty good insights about some things, but he was serious. And I said, boy, that's not a good situation. But anyway, we won't judge him. Judge not, yes, they be judged. Matthew 7:1, right? But anyway, I don't know if I want to do his return if he asked me, to be honest with you. I've turned down some opportunities to do returns. That's the kind of thing I wouldn't tolerate, knowingly. What I got in cash, I don't have to report it. That's not what the IRS says. If it's income, it's income, whether you got it or not. But the story I was going to tell real quickly was a guy, a creationist. He did tapes, books, went around the states, the country, speaking at churches. And he came to a church that I used to be a member of, and my wife grew up in, down in South Alabama. And he came and he did a Saturday night session and spoke on Sunday morning, Sunday night. Had the book table out with the books and the tapes and CDs. And but guess what? He refused to do. He refused to give the financial secretary a W-9 with his federal ID number on it, because he was going to be paid more than $600, and so she was supposed to give him a 1099. He refused, so I just, no, I'm not going to do that. She called me that Monday morning and said, so-and-so has refused, what should I do? I said, well, and I told her which publication to look up. I said, the publication says you are required to do what's called backup withholding. And that's take 21% of whatever he's earned, is backup withholding, and you send it into the IRS on his behalf, if you will. That's the rule. And so she did that. So he got, what would it be, 79% of the money that let's say he was supposed to get $1,000. He only got 79% of it, because she held 21% of it and sent it into the IRS. And also, when she sent it into the IRS, guess what? The IRS then found out about it, because guess what he was trying to do? Not report income. And I'm sitting at home about 6 months later and turned on the Pensacola, Florida news at 5 o'clock, and the lead story, Christian creationist arrested by federal authorities for income tax evasion. And I said, oh, I recognize that name. And as my wife kiddingly talks about in those kind of situations, he ended up with 3 hots and a cot. Y'all know what that means? He ended up in federal prison because he refused to report income that he was earning for going around churches all over the country. And he was a sharp guy. I mean, y'all may, some of you may have heard of him or know him or whatever, but you reap what you sow. He caught up with it at some point. Anyway, those things do happen. Questions? Accountable expense reimbursement plan. I will embarrass everybody. Which church that you represent do not have an accountable expense reimbursement plan? If you know what that is. All of you have it? Or all of you don't have it? I don't know. Well, let me say this. If you don't have it, then take a look at these slides when you get back to your church. And here's from Guidestone, a sample accountable expense reimbursement plan. And if you don't have it, I would strongly recommend that you set one up and establish it at your church. And why is it so important? Well, let's say you have a minister that uses his vehicle for ministry purposes, goes to the hospital or goes to visit shut-ins or whatever. Let's say he goes to the SBC convention. I think it's in Indianapolis this June. And so that's a nice little trip from Birmingham area. And lodging and travel and those kind of things. Let's say you go to Logos and buy some software. Let's say you have a guest speaker come in and you take them to lunch. And that those meals are potentially a part of that expense. Any expense of that nature that a minister might incur, if you have the plan set up as talked about here and follow the guidelines, then you have that minister turn in periodically a list of the mileage, and here's the receipt. We went to Olive Garden, and we had the hotel at, the Hilton in Indianapolis or wherever, and the church can reimburse that minister for those expenses. If that's done that way, that is not income back to that minister. He's just being reimbursed for expenses. Just like our kids, 25 and 29, we still send them to the store to buy a loaf of bread. It's $4.12, and they come back, well, where's my $4.12? I mean, they want to be reimbursed. I don't know where they got that from the grandparents, I guess. But anyway, those expenses are not income. It's just reimbursement of expenses that have been incurred. But about 4 or 5 years ago, if you had those expenses and you weren't reimbursed by the church, you could potentially deduct them on your federal and state income tax return through Form 2106, and then those numbers flow through to Schedule A. They cut that out about 3 or 4 years ago. So if you have ministry mileage, for example, let's say you use your car 5,200 miles for the year, and the church, for whatever reason, doesn't reimburse you. Formally, you could put those 5,200 miles on your tax return and have deductions for it. For 2024, the rate is 67 cents a mile. So that would be a nice amount of money if you're looking at the IRS rate. But if the church doesn't reimburse you, now you can't do anything with that. So you've had 5,200 miles put on your vehicle, the wear and tear and all that, with no tax consequence. You can't do anything about it. So that's an advantage, and I think one of the other, that treasurer's tips that we looked at earlier in the packet, it has some advantages and disadvantages of having an accountable plan. So I would implore you, if you do not have one, to please look at that information. If you have questions about it, feel free to give me a call. I'd be glad to help you any way we can. But that is very important. You need to follow the guidelines. You need to have the church establish the plan. But it's very important. and those can be reimbursed with no tax consequence. Okay, and there's a list. Lodging, meals, convention, conference registration, education, book subscription, software, all those kind of things. If you take them bowling one night, I'll talk about ministry activities, that would be considered a reimbursable expense in that kind of plan and so forth. And of course, records need to be maintained. And there's a sample plan again, and then I've got one in the packet for Guidestone. It may be the same one, I don't know. A little bit different, but there's one in there you can't read. This one at least you can read because the print is so small for me having to get it on the slide. And there's just an example of a plan and the expenses for a month. You have mileage to the conference. Again, this was in 23, so the rate was 65.5 cents a mile. For 2024, it's 67 cents a mile. The meals, hotel, and then you bought some Sunday school materials, so that's $296. You turn that in to Ms. Financial Secretary, and she writes you a check for $296. She distributes that according to QuickBooks or ACS or whatever software you're using for the budget purposes. But that's $296. It's not income. It doesn't show up on the W-2 or anything. That's just reimbursing them for expenses that were incurred during the course of ministry. Okay? Questions?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So it doesn't show up on my W-2, but it's income. Now it's not income. So I don't need to do anything with it?
The numbers we were just talking about?
Yes, that $296. I need to, how does my accountant deal with that? What does he do?
It is, you said it is on there, it's not supposed to be, or?
No, I'm saying, okay, so I followed your plan.
Okay, if the church, or you administer a church or a nonprofit, you mentioned nothing about nonprofit.
Church.
Okay. Your church has a accountable plan that they've approved.
Yes.
So you turned in that was your expense report, and you had $296, and Ms. Secretary wrote you a check for $296. That should not be income to you. That should not be on your W-2. If it is on your W-2 and you have a plan that has been adhered to, then she just made an error, and you respectfully ask for a corrected W-2 that doesn't reflect it, because that's not income to you. It shouldn't be on there.
Gotcha.
Okay? That answered that for you? Okay? All right. How are we on time? Okay, we've got 22 minutes. I told you we wouldn't finish, didn't I? Just a couple slides on internal versus external control features. Counting team, I have a lot of questions and a lot of issues related to that. We'll get to the embezzlement slide in a minute, and I'll tell a little story. I won't take your time right now. But anyway, you want to have trustworthy, honest people of integrity on your accounting teams. You need to have written instructions for them. You need to train them. You need to show and tell them how to do that. Do you put it in the safe on Sunday and then come back up there Monday morning and count it? That kind of thing. But know exactly, have the proper documentation, the envelopes, if you still use envelopes. If you have electronic giving, I would think most churches in this group would have electronic giving, so you're going to have records there that we didn't use in the past, but records to keep up with documenting that and making sure it's on the contribution statements and so forth. One Monday morning story real quick. A pastor, not a pastor, but a deacon down in Florida, a big church, would come in on Mondays because that's when the finance team would come and count the offerings. Put it in the safe on Sunday, and then Monday morning they'd come up there. And he would come up there every Monday, and he was a coin collector. You know where this is going already? He wanted to buy all the coinage out of the offering place. It's a big church, and this was a few years back when we still, it was pre-COVID, when you still, most churches down our way don't even pass the plates anymore. They just have a box in the back usually. But anyway, he would come in and he said, I want to buy all the coinage because I'm a coin collector, and there was a 1906 penny in there worth $5 million or whatever. So he would usually have to write a check for $200 or $300 each week. It's a pretty big church. So far, so good, right? So what he would do at tax time is he would add up all of the checks that he wrote to the church for the year, including those 52 weekly checks to buy the coinage. And he put those as donations on his tax return. I didn't do that return. Guess what? It wasn't on his contribution statement. So why was he deducting it? Don't know, but he did. He's probably in the same cell as Mr. Creation is, because he got arrested as well. Because his return was audited, and they found out, because he went to the church and said, hey, I need to get you to write a supplemental letter or contribution statement, addendum or whatever, because I've got all these checks and I wrote y'all for buying those coinage. Oop, that's not deductible as a contribution. So anyway, I know people in Birmingham don't do those kinds of crazy things, but it's, I told Brother Mike last night when we were having dinner, I said, I wouldn't want to stand next to someone like that, to be honest with you, for fear that I'd get hit by a lightning bolt. I really, somebody stealing from the church, or indirectly, you know, taking advantage of an opportunity as a deacon of a Southern Baptist church, that's scary. Anyway, I digress. So, segregation of duties with your accounting. A lot of small churches can't do this. They've got one lady, she does everything. She prints the bulletin, they still use bulletins on Sunday. She makes the, just like the gentleman that I mentioned earlier, been there 25 years. He's an elder, he's the church treasurer, and until I got involved, she didn't even, the financial secretary didn't even have a key to the post office back. He had cataract surgery and had complications, was out like 3 weeks. They couldn't get the mail. They couldn't get their bills because he had to own the key and he refused to give it to anybody. Whew. Anyway, small churches have troubles with this segregation of duties and so forth, but you need to have as many controls in place as you possibly can. Have someone else reconcile the bank statement each month. I was teaching the Larry Burkett class on Sunday nights one time. Y'all know, remember who Larry Burkett was? All the guys, Mike and ladies, but he was a financial planner and deceased now. Had Sunday night material, discipleship material, and I talked one Sunday night about reconciling your bank statement and making sure that you know where you're. Lady raised her hand. She's a brand new client of mine. I just opened my firm in 1992, so this was in 92. She raised her hand and said, what? You just used a term I'm not familiar with. I said, I'm trying to think back. Okay, what? You said reconcile, reconcile? What does that mean? And I thought they were kidding. They were really fun-loving, jovial people. They were in my Sunday school class. Kim and I were teaching, Sunday school, adult Sunday school. I thought they were just picking. I really did. I said, oh, come on. She looked at her husband, poked him in the ribs. Do you know what that means? He said, no, I don't have a clue. So I said, okay. So I explained to him what reconciling the bank statement was. Balancing your checkbook. Take the bank statement and take whatever records if you're keeping any and figure out if your bank balance is right. And she said, oh, okay. You know what? We've been married 18 years, and we've only had like 3 or 4 checks bounced in those 18 years. We're so lucky. I said, no, you're not lucky. You're blessed. If you've never bounced your checkbook in 18 years, or you're independently wealthy and don't need to worry about it. But most people in their first years of marriage have to watch it a little closer than that. But anyway, she didn't know what that meant. So you don't ever want to assume when you use a particular term that everyone knows what you're talking about. But anyway, having some sort of internal audit team or your finance team, have someone, if possible, on your finance team that's a banker or a business owner or an accountant or someone. That's one of the main reasons I was told that I was nominated to be a trustee at the New Orleans Seminary, because I was a CPA and they needed a CPA on that trustee board. Well, guess what? That was great. I was nominated. They nominated like February, March, I believe, and then It's voted on at the convention each June. And I asked a couple of questions after I was nominated. So one question, when are the meetings held? So, well, it's different times, but, we'll let you know plenty of time, and it won't be a problem. And I was honored to be selected, and so I agreed to be nominated. I was selected in June 2008, I guess, as I started in the fall of 2008 and served 2 5-year terms. It's one of the blessings of my life to serve over there with the great people in New Orleans. But I had an orientation session like in August, and the first time I found out, the meetings are in April and October every year. Well, for a CPA, they wanted so bad to be on the board of trustees.
Worst time.
The busiest time of my year is April and October, because that's the tax deadlines. So there were some times in the early part of that first 5-year tenure that I missed some meetings because I'm a solo practitioner. I don't have 28 people cranking out tax returns in the back 40 or whatever. It's myself and my wife. My wife's got a minor in accounting, but she's got a full-time job at the University of Mobile. And so there were a couple of times I just couldn't make it. And they weren't doing Zoom calls and all that back in the day. So anyway, I told them, I said, you guys just need to change these meetings just a week. I mean, they would have it like April the 12th. But just have it the 19th. I can come in. And they never did change it. But anyway, I certainly love the opportunity to have served. But anyway, have competent people looking at the finances, having budgets. If you don't have a budget, please, adhere one, know what your variances are, look at your expenses, and what your budget is versus. Budget is just a guideline. It's not, oh my goodness, we got $12 left in the budget. We can't spend anything. The kids can't go to camp because we don't have enough money. You have to be realistic, but the budget is a guideline. But if you don't have one, you should take a look at it.
If I give a quick plug,
Yes, sir.
that if there's some churches in here who need help with their bookkeeping, then they need to talk to Michael Evans here at the Association with the
Yes.
Gas Ministry.
Yes.
That is an unbelievable service.
And I saw that last year, and I've been wanting to either get back on the phone or get back up here. And I don't have time this trip, but I may invite myself again after tax season. I'd love to come up here and meet with all those involved because I'm intrigued very much so by the service that the association offers, because I'm sure the association sees it's a much needed service, especially for smaller churches that can't afford an audit, can't afford a full-time accountant on staff, can't even afford a full-time financial secretary. So I'm sure you got to stand in the gap, if you will, for some of those services. So yes, I would totally contact those involved in that
And
situation.
I can come behind this gentleman and echo the same thing. They were wonderful.
Correct. Payroll practices, making sure you have all your payroll documents, your withholding forms, a personnel file. If someone has been reprimanded, there needs to be something in writing in that personnel file. Do background checks. I mean, we know and hear all about the horrors, and we know what the convention as an entity has been going through and is still going through, is related to sexual abuse situations in the past. Do your background checks. The church in my area, not related to sexual abuse, but they did a credit check for a prospective pastor, and they asked the guy on the search committee to get up on Wednesday night and make a report about where they were in the process. And someone from the floor asked, have you done a credit check on this person, a background check, and related to credit? I said, yeah, we did a credit check. His credit's about like most of ours. It wasn't too good, but we're probably hanging in there with him. Well, again, long story short, he almost bankrupted the church, and they ultimately had to ask him to leave. It's a long story, and I won't get into it here with 10 minutes to spare, but that was the craziest situation I think I'd ever heard of. Why do you do it if you get negative results and you still keep moving through the process? He had serious credit flaws. I mean, serious. I don't mean, he was 2 days late with his light bill. I mean, he had serious flaws on his credit, and they should have, been more aware of it and so forth. Anyway, Electronic giving with disbursement approval, don't have the same person approving the disbursements and writing the checks and balancing the checkbook. That's a trifecta that you don't want to have. That's where you have a fraud and embezzlement coming from. Again, you say, well, we've only got 3 people in the office, and you know, she's young. Do something. Call me if you can't think of any suggestions, and I'll come up with some for you, because you don't want the same person shuffling all those, juggling all those positions and those responsibilities, because it can lead to serious situations. Electronic giving, I have a whole separate PowerPoint on the list there if you'd like to get a copy of that. If you're not doing electronic giving at your church, you need to probably seriously consider. A lot of websites I look at these days, it's right there on the home page. Give, a big give block where you can pop on there and you can go online and give. So there's a list in the PowerPoint that I've got. It's got some of the recommended organizations that utilize electronic giving. You guys probably can give some testimonials to some that you've used that have been successful and some that may have not been, but it is important these days. Church ministerial love offerings. I've got 9 minutes. I have an altar call at the end here, so. Church ministerial love offerings. If it's for a church employee, according to the IRS, it's reportable as income on Form W-2. If it's for a non-employee, reportable on 1099 NEC. My buddy example that I talked about a while ago, well, I'll just get it in cash. Well, okay, it's still income. If it's for services having had been rendered or previously rendered. If you go out in the parking lot and see Brother Pastor as he's getting in his car and hand him a $100 gift card for Olive Garden and say, brother, take your family out to lunch today. That's income to him. Because you're doing that not because he's a nice guy or he had a pretty red tie on. It's because you're recognizing him for services throughout his tenure, or most specifically probably for that sermon he just preached. And so you have to be very, very careful with that and handle it under the circumstances that you need to. But again, those slides, and I won't go into all of them in detail due to time. Sir?
Go back to that third, what is that third dot? What is that saying? Love offerings made direction from the donor to the minister. What is that saying?
Love offerings made directly from a donor to a minister or church employee are generally considered personal gifts and not deductible as contributions. If it's not in the parking lot, if it's not walking up on the, if it's, you know, if you went to play golf one day and decided to give him a $100 bill or whatever, those can be considered gifts. But if it's in any way tied in and related to his service, now the only exception to that is in certain cases, and I think it's talked about in a couple of slides on, if it's in the area of a retirement situation and you're recognizing his 25 years of ministry at that church and he's about to retire, that can sometimes be a different situation. But if of course the IRS is everywhere, but they're not going to be sitting there in the parking lot watching you when you give him that gift card or that $100 bill or whatever. But if it's a situation, and it's difficult to explain because there's really not too many circumstances where it would not be considered income. But I do put that in there as an exception, but you just have to look at the facts and circumstances in each situation to determine that. Okay? Got some questions there, but we'll finish with time and try to, again, I know I won't finish, but we're close anyway. At a church in Moss Point, Mississippi, I was supposed to go to July the 8th of last year to give this same conference except the 4-hour version. And I had a trip to South Georgia, meeting with a church in June the 19th, I think it was. It was a Monday, and Monday night was an elders meeting, and then I was meeting with the church secretary on Tuesday. we got to the location, turned on the Weather Channel at the restaurant, and saw that, and we'd already gotten a call from both our son and our daughter that Mobile was under a tornado warning, and it pretty rough, and you know, we're okay, but you know, say a prayer for us and so forth. And in just a few minutes, I saw a live report on the Weather Channel from Moss Point, Mississippi, and it showed a church, and the roof was gone, and half the siding was gone, the wood, you know, the wood structure, and showed the rest of the grounds of the church. And they named the church, and that's the church that I'm supposed to go speak to on July the 8th. This was June the 19th. So their church was literally destroyed by a hurricane. They wanted me to come anyway, and I did go, and we met at a credit union offices. One of the church members was on the board of the credit union, and they graciously allowed us to use their facilities. So I still presented this to them. But I put these slides in there just as a result of that, because what they did is they had to establish a storm fund. People were making donations on behalf to help in the recovery effort, not only for their church, but the community. That was serious, and it went months. They finally got some help from the federal government. This is not here for political discussion. They had to fight for months to get any kind of federal relief for a tornado damage. Just literally not totally wiped out that community, and that's like 30 minutes from our house. And so I put these slides in there as per their request, talking about, well, what do we do? We're getting this money, and what do we do? Can we put it in the same account? Well, you can, but it would be preferable to set up a separate bank account for those designated funds, and you're helping the community, or you're going to help with they're still dealing with the insurance about storm damage, but they had to knock the building down, the sanctuary, because it was, you know, couldn't be repaired and so forth. So anyway, all the guidelines for contribution receipts, make sure you know the guidelines, and I don't know if I have yes, IRS publication 1828, that second bullet there. If you don't know that one too, that's one that you need to look at and let your financial secretary be aware of, as it relates to contributions and statements, and under what circumstances you're supposed to give detailed receipts if it's over $250 in some cases, and you have to put language on there that no goods or services were provided. I had a secretary call me one day and said that lady that does the graphics for the Sunday morning services, she comes up here on Fridays for a couple of hours, and she wants to get a contribution, a donation for her time, for the 2 hours that she spends up here putting in the graphics for the sermon outline. I said, well, she may want to, but you can't do that. Why not? Well, services are not a charitable contribution. So if you run across that, you can remember we talked about that. That's not something that you can add to their contribution statement. Okay? Bivocational consideration. Any of you bivocational? No? Okay. Well, we won't. There's some good information there, including some extra things. And Dr. Crane probably could tell us about that as well, and others maybe on staff. But there are some extra benefits I didn't know about until I started researching them. That are available through the state board and through Guidestone, I think, in some cases, for some additional incentives, insurance coverage, and that kind of thing. So if you are bivocational or know of someone, you might want to check into that. Okay? We've got 2 minutes. Told you I wouldn't finish, but I'm trying. Here's some 2023 tax developments slide, and then I've got 2 different, one that I prepared. It's just the 21 and 22, and that one should be in there because now we've got, should have put the 22 and 23 in there, so I apologize for that. But there is one that says Journal of Accountancy, Filing Season Quick Guide, Tax Year 2023. And that has the rates in there, the standard deduction, the self-employment tax calculation we talked about, standard mileage rate for 2023, medical mileage. You know, you could take medical mileage, if you itemize, you could take medical mileage going back and forth to the doctor, going back and forth for chemo or co-pays, all those kind of things, contacts, eyeglasses, all those potential medical deductions, some of the tax credits and so forth. I do apologize for having that 21, 22, and I put the wrong one in there. Anyway, so there's some slides there on the developments. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call and I'll be glad to help you. Does the church need an audit? Again, audits these days, a true financial statement audit for a church, the least expensive one I've heard about in the last year was $13,000. And most churches can't afford that. And so again, as I mentioned, I don't do audits anymore. I do the agreed upon procedures. And basically I get with the leadership and they say they want me to look at payroll, they want me to look at the approval process for disbursements, who's on the signature card for the checks, those kind of things, and a laundry list, and that's agreed upon procedure. We've agreed to check those things. And I can do that for $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 at the most, or whatever it may be, but it's not $13,000 or $14,000 or $15,000 for an audit. And you can't guarantee catching fraud or embezzlement in an audit anyway. So what we need to audit, the church needs an audit. Got a new pastor coming in, he wants an audit. Well, do you want to spend $12,000 or $14,000 or $15,000? No, we can't do that. So, well, you probably won't get an audit, but you can do some things to help take a look at recent history or to have plans, have policies and procedures. Unbelievable amount of churches that don't have written policies and procedures. They just go on the fly. Talked to a church last week. What kind of software do you use? Software? I know you at least use Excel spreadsheets. No, we don't have anybody in the church that knows how to use Excel. We just write it down on a ledger. Well, you know, some people may have to do that, but anyway, you want to make sure that your records are such that if you're ever audited or if anybody ever needs to look at something, they can know what to look at. Okay? Church accounting tips, church embezzlement examples. I mentioned one about the coinage guy, Sunday school guy, the church I used to attend. He figured out who gave cash during Sunday school. He got those envelopes. He was like back in the day when you used the metal boxes and had the attendance written on little sheets with the carbon paper on it. So it's been a few years back. He figured out who was giving cash, and he would get those envelopes with a letter opener, put the cash in his left hand pocket, and put the envelopes in the right hand pocket. They decided, let me know if we need to leave. They decided, she called me and said, the pastor and the executive pastor are no longer at the church. Do you think it would be prudent to send out quarterly contribution statements, just to check all our activities? I said, I think that's a great idea. Well, she did that, and the next Monday, she called me and said, I've already had 14 phone calls at the church office this morning in the first 2 hours, and every one of them are members of the same Sunday school department, and every one of them, for whatever reason, have been given cash in their envelopes during Sunday school. And so this guy figured it out. He was stealing the cash money from the envelopes, taking the envelopes with him where there was no record going to the church. So when they sent those contribution statements out, they were all wrong for those people because they give hundreds and hundreds of dollars in a 3-month period, more than the church was showing. And they didn't prosecute him, but he was asked to leave the church as a result of that. But anyway, and a lot of other examples there. You see Baptist Press articles all the time. You know, $106,000 stolen, $400,000 stolen. Credit cards set up in the church's name, but the secretary is using all kinds of things. And so a lot of things that you can do to counteract that. So just be prepared, be aware of that. Okay? Questions, comments, recipe, ideas? No? Thank you very much for the opportunity, Dr. Crane. I hope it was beneficial and had some questions answered. If you have questions that you didn't get a chance to mention, be glad to stay here a few minutes and answer any questions you may have. Again, thank you for the opportunity, and God bless you, and hope that wasn't a tornado warning. Amber alert, okay. And I've got this copy if you didn't.
I got another one.
Okay.
How did you say we get the recording from today? How do we get the recording from today?
Marisa, when you send that out on